photography books, biographies, cookbooks, and more. Begin at 9:30 in the state capitol in Galloway Church, and will run all day. You can find the complete schedule online, and I guess the first public event is Thursday evening at The Plant, which was formerly Eco Shed. Then join us next week for History's Lunch when T.J. Ray will discuss his book, No Lawful Defense, Contemporary Accounts of Mississippi Lynchings, 1835 to 1964. Today, I am delighted to welcome Beverly Lowry to discuss her book, Deer Creek Drive, A Reckoning of Memory and Murder in the Mississippi Delta. Beverly Lowry was born in Memphis and raised in Greenville. She attended the University of Mississippi before earning her BA in English Literature from Memphis State University. After working as an actor in New York City, Lowry moved to Texas and taught at the University of Houston. She was later director of George Mason University's creative nonfiction program. Lowry is the author of 6 novels and 5 works of nonfiction, the latest of which is Deer Creek Drive. She's received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts, and in 2007, she received the Natchez Literary and Cinema Celebration's Richard Wright Award for Excellence in Literature. John Grisham wrote of Deer Creek Drive, mixed together a bloody murder in a privileged white family, a false accusation against a black man, a suspicious town, a sensational trial with colorful lawyers, and a punishment that didn't fit the crime, and you have the best of Southern Gothic fiction. But the very best part is that the story is true. Hey, welcome, Beverly Lowry.
Thanks for coming, y'all. I want you to know that I woke up at 2 this morning, alive with some thoughts about what I was going to say today, and changed everything. So what you're hearing is pretty new, and I have a little treat for you, which I'll share pretty quickly into my little talk, which is something that you will be the first people ever to hear. I can't promise that you'll love it, or I think it's pretty funny. But anyway, that's to come. What I started thinking about was, and your flag's flying outside saying, don't just learn history, feel it. I saw them on my way in. I thought that's what woke me up at 2, that the sense that where do books come from? Where did this come from? How do we know? So what my focus is sort of the history of my history of writing books about murder. Nothing happens nowhere, does it? Nothing takes place outside of time. We stagger through the elements given us, time, place, weather, and so on, wondering not so much what was happening at that particular place and point in our lives, but why. Where did we come up with ideas, notions leading to certain often puzzling actions? Did we decide to do something? Or were we perhaps attached to unknown sources beyond everyday comprehension? Writers, I believe, or anyway some of us, write what we write when something, an idea, a memory, a turn of phrase, a slight conversation with someone starts to nag at us. And it nags, and like a musical earworm that won't let us go, finally we yield and say, I give. Okay, I'll do it. And we begin. I grew up in Greenville, as Chris just told you. I went to public school there from first grade through high school. I want to read a little something first. This is not what I referred to. In 1985, after I'd published a couple of novels, novels, the indomitable Dorothy Abbott, who some of you may know, got together, edited an anthology of fiction from Mississippi writers and nonfiction. And I wrote this in an essay I wrote in the nonfiction tome called A White Girl Remembers. I never wanted to write about Greenville or the South. I, in fact, considered the idea and decided against it. Too many Southern books had already been written, and the literary legacy of William Alexander Percy, drilled into our heads from first grade to 12th, had become burdensome. By the time I began writing a novel, I'd moved to new ground. I thought I was a different person, a city person, a Manhattan person, and then a Texas person who needed Greenville. Yet my first novel proceeded, not on its own exactly, but willfully gathering place and characters the way candy in a pocket collects lint. First, there was a twirler marching down a street, tossing her silver baton in the sky. Then there was the street itself. Wasn't it Washington Avenue in downtown Greenville? Wasn't the furniture store she passed actually Sanage Furniture? The owner having decided his name spelled backwards more exotic than the other way around. And little by little, the town, with or without decisions, created itself. And I was back in Greenville. In book jacket and publicity copy, my publisher kept claiming the book was set in Mississippi, although in no place in the book is the name of the state mentioned. There's a big river, but it too is left unnamed. My particular story then is of a white girl who grew up in William Alexander Percy's town in the 50s. When I was 10, something momentous happened in Leland, a much smaller town than Greenville, 9 miles away, a town we knew as really part of our general lives there in the area known to us all as the Delta. A woman was slashed to death in her own home, a roomy and very fine house, settled to this day and in prime condition in what is still considered the best street in Leland, Deer Creek Drive. When I first went to Leland to do some research and talk to a few people, I was told at least twice, maybe 3 times, Deer Creek Drive. If you want to go to heaven, you got to live on Deer Creek Drive. That was said then, and it's said now. The weapon? Pruning shears, garden shears. In newspapers all over the country, the victim will be identified as Society Matron Mrs. J.W. Idella Thompson. She was 67. The only other person in the house with her at the time was her 43-year-old daughter, Ruth Dickins, to whom the shears belonged. When the coroner testified at her trial, he will say that Mrs. Thompson had been cut a minimum of 150 times. Go to Leland today, ask around. It won't take you long to find someone who'll know her name. Ruth Dickins, they'll say, isn't she the woman who killed her mother? In newspaper articles of the time, she will be identified as a socialite. During the next year, my mother and I talked of little else. In time, of course, we moved past it, but some of us were haunted by the unspeakable possibilities inherent in such an action, haunted by it far beyond our own reckoning. We couldn't get past it. The thing rested deep in our psyches, whether we knew it or recognized it or acknowledged it or not. In 2018, when I began writing Deer Creek Drive, I came to Mississippi from Texas, where I now live, on a research trip. I was on my way to the Hot Tamale Festival in Greenville and to start doing research for a possible book about this murder and the Delta and my life in those 16 years I lived there. The first place I came was right here, not this museum, but the archives next door, and met Katie Blunt, who was at that time fairly new at the directorship. She was amazingly, enormously helpful, and I found a lot of material there, including something I'll mention a couple of times, the trial transcripts. If any of you ever write about a trial, if you can come up with the trial transcripts, they aren't always saved, especially from as far back as this murder occurred, you have gold in your research, because people are questioned, what were you doing at 12? What were you doing at 12:05? And you get a moment-by-moment sense of how the thing occurred. Then I went to Greenville. And when I was there, I went to the Greenville History Museum in downtown Greenville. And I looked over, and there was a collection and the collections in the Greenville History Museum, which is organized by one Benji Nelkin, is his project. He runs it. He is everything in that museum. I don't think he has a computer. He didn't at that time. There was no copy machine. He collects things he can hold in his hands and turn the pages of or hold up for you to see. There were copies of our student newspaper, which we called the Pica. It's named for a font, which is actually pica, but it was known to us as the Pica. I remembered that in my senior year in high school, I had asked to contribute a story, a short story, a two-part short story in the Pica. And I was given permission to do it. And the page on which this little piece, and I'm not going to read it all, but I will give you a little opening of it, in which it appeared. It is called The Axeman Strikes. The huge von Rathbone estate lies silent, like a sprawling monster waiting for its prey. Suddenly, a shrill, splitting scream shatters the silence like thin, delicate crystal. Mr. Ethan Van Rathbone looks up from his book in the study of his home. There's another scream, more terrifying than the first, and another, and then a low, pitiful moaning, a gurgling of blood, and silence. Dorothy, the maid, breaks away from the arms of her lover, Horace, the butler, and they hurry from the kitchen into the study. Albert von Rathbone, age 19, glances up from his baby doll and grins stupidly. a wild, sinister look in his glassy blue eyes. Mrs. Lucretia von Rathbone, queen of society, has been hacked to death in her boudoir. Tess Transom, girl private eye, is called to inspect for clues. Now, you should know I was a big Nancy Drew fan, and so I figure Tess Transom was me. She finds that Mrs. Rathbone was preparing for bed when her assassin leapt through the balcony windows and literally hacked Lucretia to death. I'm going to leave out the details because some of you just ate lunch and you might not want to hear it, but I'm telling you, I went as far out on a limb to describe what was done to Lucretia von Rathbone as a person ought not go. And apparently, at the end of this list, she had been sitting at her dressing table when the man with an axe struck. And the story ends with who killed. It goes on to say she worked in the church. She was a beloved member of the town. Who would want to kill her? Who would do such a thing to this fine woman? Who killed Lucretia Rathbone, the story asks. Does the gray material found on a bramble bush mean anything? Does Albert, the lunatic son, know anything? Will Tess Transom find the murderer? Read the next issue of the Pika and find out. Well, the Axeman never appeared because I kept being asked by people, how could you write that stuff? That is horrible, Beverly. What persuaded you to go that far and write all that bloody stuff? I was shocked because it wasn't a real nose that had been hacked away from a face. It was a story. And so I simply didn't finish the story. I didn't write the next installment because it threw me so off from what I was doing that I thought, forget it. Plus, honestly, between you and me, I didn't know who the X-Man was anyway, or if there is one. I was creating it as I went. So that was when people have asked me a similar question. I've written 3 books that at the center is not just a murder, not just somebody getting shot in the street, but a really horrific murder that goes beyond kind of the bounds of understanding and shocks whatever town or city it takes place in. And it has become something. I talked to Harding Carter III about this, the late Harding, and he said, oh my God, Beverly, he was editor of the Democrat Times at that time. That was the biggest thing that ever happened in Greenville. So that kind of murder. I became, in short time after I started writing, I wrote better than I did when I wrote The Axeman, I think. But I began writing fiction, and I published 3 novels and was at work on the 4th when a tragedy happened in my family that caused me to be unable to consider making things up, anything I was able to do. My younger son, Peter, was killed in a hit-and-run incident. And I think, and again, you know, we try to figure these things out and come up with something, and maybe it has something to do with the truth, and maybe not. I felt like real life had betrayed me, and I wanted to explore real life, and nothing else satisfied me other than real life. I became enamored of, obsessed with a beautiful young woman who was on death row in Gainesville, Texas. This is where the Axeman appears as a woman. She and her boyfriend together killed 2 people with a pickaxe. She had been, one of her lawyers who had been assigned to her, appointed to her, said at the time he thought she was the embodiment of evil. There was a picture of her in the Houston Chronicle, after some years in prison. And she was lovely, and she looked, I would say, her face, the look in her eyes, was a look of innocence. It was a look, I thought, I would, if I just saw this and didn't know who she was or what she'd done, I would think, this is a kind, good person. Well, that hooked me. And I wrote Carla, found out how to write her, and said, can I come visit you? I wasn't thinking about a book yet. I just wanted to meet her. And I felt like death was our subjects, both of us. And she wrote back and said, come on, I got nothing but time. So I went, and it was my first visit to a maximum security prison. And Carla and I ended up talking. She had confessed. This is a murder that without a mystery as to who did it. The why was a big question, but not the perpetrator. So she had nothing to lose by telling me, giving me details of what had happened that night. She never blamed, she was on drugs, she never blamed the drugs, she never made excuses, and at that point, she thought she deserved to die. I'd never met anybody like her. Obviously, I'd never been in a situation like that to talk to somebody who had not only done what she did, but was willing to talk about it and pay for what she'd done. I was always seated in a visiting room with a plexiglass between us, and we never touched, but we always put hands to the plexiglass, and that was our way of touching before I left. And I thought, in a sense, we crossed over through the plexiglass and reached one another. So the title of the book is Crossed Over, a Murder, a Memoir. I did have the trial transcripts of the trial, of her trial and the trial of her comrade who committed the crime with her. And so they were capital cases both. And so I learned to do trial research and to track down what I wasn't sure of. And I think finding history, I mean, we do it every day, a lot of times a day. We find out where something happened and when, and we look it up and say, we go to Google or something and say, what was this like? I mean, who invented this? That's finding history. I know this is lunch is history, yeah. It's all comes together. And I created the history of her family, the details of who she was and how she grew up, and to come to some understanding of how this terrible event occurred. She was eventually executed by the state of Texas in 1999, the first woman to be executed in the state since the Civil War, years after the Civil War. So that was my first book that contained a murder that was known, and the trial was in the paper every day, just like this one was, and people kept up with it day by day by day. I did. I lived in Houston at the time, and it was horrific and kind of beyond imagining. So that was my first. I moved to Texas and then left Texas, and a murder happened there in 1991 that had the same effect on a city. But this murder was of 4 young girls in a frozen yogurt shop. This one is known as the yogurt shop murders. The girls were 13, 15, and 17. And I'll leave out the tales of their murders as well, but it involved other crimes other than killing. And in the end, when whoever did this crime is still unsolved, torched the building. So clues were hard to come by. The firemen came first. And when I heard about this, it was known all over. I didn't live there at the time, but I knew about it. And one time I came to Houston to visit my son, who lived there with his family. There was 2 boys had been arrested for a while. They were eventually convicted and eventually dismissed. The charges have been dismissed for now. And there was an appeal that had a hearing that had happened in Houston. And I said, Colin, is this ever going to be out of our lives, the yogurt shop murders? And he answered directly and immediately. He said, no, they're with us forever. That was the earworm that got me, because what happened to me, the uncertainty I lived with about my younger son, who hit him, did they know, did they stop, and I would never know. And the families of these 4 girls, unless this thing was solved, and it didn't look like it was going to be, would live with that same uncertainty. So there I was. I was going to write about the crime, the trials of the 2 boys, everything I could come up with. I had the trial transcripts again, and I wrote Who Killed These Girls, which came out in 1992. So that's 2. And again, people said, why do you write these things? This is a horrible, horrible thing that happened. And I always hearken back to the murder that happened when I was 10 years old, and impressionable in ways I could not understand at the time, or pretty much ever. But so, a few years ago, 2018, the voice in my head that said, this is the book you have to write, the voice that said, it's time, when are you going to do this, started to nag at me harder, and I thought, okay, I think I'll do it. I knew that I was going to write about my life in the Delta, about the Delta itself. The time would be, Mrs. Thompson was murdered on November 17th, 1948. So we start there in the timeline of the book. And I left Greenville after I graduated from high school and didn't go back for years. And that was 1956. So I took it a little beyond that to the Brown versus Board of Education decision and thought this goes from Jim Crow past the Board of Education decision and the integration of schools in the South. This is a huge period of time as far as changes go. And I want to write about that within the context of writing about this murder. I've never wanted just to write about a murder. the murder has hooked me in ways because these murders in particular are about such extreme behavior and that seems unimaginable, unspeakable. And I want to take that on away and see if I can find the reasons. And so I finally did, and the book is basically, I think of it as braided. There's my life. I knew if I wrote about the Delta, I'd be writing about two things. Okay, the murder, but in addition, race and class. Because to a great extent, that's what, especially during that time, maybe still, not sure about the class part, but those really were the two biggest, the two biggest, I don't know, parts of life in the Mississippi Delta. And when I started looking at this trial transcript, I noticed right off that, I mean, you saw racism all through the transcripts. There was one black woman who testified in the long trial of Ruth Dickins. And we're going to see some pictures in a minute. Chris has pulled up for us and some newspaper articles from the time. That the white people are just called by their name, and the black people have colored in parentheses under there. Well, there's only one. And there were headlines in the paper, every day in the paper, front page, banner headlines, Negro almost gets into Dickens' jury. And so I thought, I'm already writing about race. The minute I opened that trial, I was writing about race and opened my computer. And as for class, I was curious about the privileges given. I was a privileged person because I was white, but they were privileged in ways. These society matrons, society ladies were privileged in ways I was not. And so it all came together, I feel like, braided together three parts. My life, the race and class issues of the Delta, and the murder, and which includes the trial and the explanation of how the murder took place, and the prosecution's motivations for the murder. So, do you want to show some pictures now, Chris? Okay, yeah, let's do it. So this, I love this picture. This is a honeymoon picture. This is Idella Thompson. And this is her husband, her new husband, J.W. Thompson. He was not from the Delta originally. He was from around Charleston. And but she was the one with the land, and her family had what was called a plantation there. And even when I was riding around Leland with a realtor who was showing me Deer Creek Drive and such, and she made a phone call while I was riding with her about some land. I don't know what it was, and I said, I didn't know your family had land. And she said, I don't know why anybody would live in the Delta if they didn't have land, you know. So she was the one with the land. He bought more land, and he ran a good general store in addition for farmers, very big in Leland at that time. They had 4 children, Ruth among them, and Mr. Thompson died 9 years before his wife was murdered, and he was either shot or he committed suicide. It was all a secret. The paper said he died after a long illness, and a friend helped me find the death certificate, which is right over there as well. And it says, the death certificate says cause of death, gunshot to the head. And reason, it says homicide, suicide, or accident. It says unknown. And so people say what they want. It's at any rate, he died violently as well. This is Ruth, and this is a horrible picture. It appeared in the New York Post. And this is not her way of dressing. I wonder if that's not a prison shirt. I don't know. But this is after she was arrested and after the trial and after she was convicted. And so this could be in the jail, the Washington County Jail. The trial was held in Greenville because it's the county seat of Washington County. And I talked to one man who said he had graduated from high school and was planning to go to law school, and his father told him, if you want to know about the law, go down to the courthouse and watch this trial of Ruth Dickins. He went every day, and he said that the courthouse was jammed. People lined up an hour and a half before the doors opened to get in. And it was, to a great extent, women. Women read true crime, and women were at that trial, and they were clearly on the side of the prosecution. But they brought lunches in little, bags and drinks, and Coca-Colas were sold in the courtroom at lunchtime, and hot dogs. Nobody wanted to give up his or her seat. And this man said they brought lemonade and iced tea. And so that's Ruth. And every newspaper article I read about the trial and the murder, about the trial, described her as having a mannish bob. She wore her hair cut really uncharacteristically for the time, in a cut pretty much like that, and chopped off at the neck, which, and the calling it a mannish bob had its own reverberations, which seem obvious to me as to why she would do something like this. And she refused to dress the way lawyers want their defendants to dress, which is, properly. She wore plain dresses and big clunky shoes, no jewelry. It was always mentioned. She wore only a watch, no hat, no gloves. So, okay. These are, excuse me, after she was convicted. By the way, sorry. If you can see this line, Ruth said, when the police came, a Negro killed her mother. A friend of mine in Austin, who's black and was himself a prosecutor for many years, said to me, Beverly, any black man who read your book and got to the point when Ruth Dickins was the only person in the house, and she said she was all messed up, and she said a black man did it, would know she did it. So I took his word for it. But amazingly enough, with all that was going on at that time and all the unfairness and repression, the sheriff was interviewed in December, less than a month after the murders, and somebody asked if he had found the man who did it. And Sheriff Foote said, "We have interviewed over 100 men, period. There is no Negro." I found that pretty amazing because they had sent out a posse. The posse didn't just go find somebody and declare him the killer. And the sheriff was willing to say after less than a month. And at that point, we all knew, because there was nobody else. It was her. So this is one of the many, many stories. I don't know what, oh, this was in Greenville. This Charlie Curd. Okay, we got anything else? Show that picture. Yeah. This is her lawyer, Ben Wilkes, who was known as one of the best, if not the best, defense attorney in the state. The prosecutors had just been, the city attorney had only just been elected some 6 months prior to the trial, and they were both in their 20s. It was thought to be a clear case to Ben Wilkes to win because he was experienced and skillful. He lost the first appeal, and some people think he died that summer, the same summer of the trial that this trial killed him. This is John Dickins, Ruth's husband, who stood by her and organized petitions to get her out of prison. She was sent to Parchman for life. Didn't stay that long, but she was sent. This is Sheriff Foote in front, behind him, Ben Wilkes, the attorney. Ruth, this is the kind of dress she wore. And John, that's her nephew, and up there is Ben Wilkes' nephew, B.B. Wilkes, who assisted him. And this is also, as you can see on the faces of these people, it is, and Sheriff Foote knew Ms. Dickins. In the interview they had with her as a witness, not as a potential murderer, she calls him Hughie. His name was Hugh W. And because they knew each other, and so he has now, that's his paper that admits her to the jail, and then the Harris County Jail, Washington County Jail, and then to Parchman. He's not happy. He has convicted a friend to prison, potentially for the rest of her life. Yeah, and that the reason the archives, to my great fortune, and anybody who wants to read about this trial, reason the archives has it is because the case went to the state Supreme Court. If it's on appeal, the transcripts and the evidence, all the evidence is not there, but some of it is. Some very tiny envelopes with hairs in them that were discovered in the house. That's why they are sent to the archives until a decision is made that the thing is over. This is called Privilege and Money. Ms. Dickins needed surgery after about 3 years, and the warden and the governor were told that if they allowed her to come home to have the surgery, they would pay for everything. And so she was allowed to come home to have major surgery, which the governor described as the worst surgery a woman can have, which pretty much says exactly what she had. And after she had the surgery, her doctor wrote in and said she wasn't ready to come back. She stayed at home for 4 months and reacquainted with her friends. She had a couple of leaves, but the warden was known for giving Christmas leaves, good behavior. That was, I mean, she got hers pretty early, but she had in a way earned them. And her case was eventually, she was given a suspended sentence and allowed to come home after about 5.5 years in prison. Yeah, that's when she was released, and this is the note of her death. She went back to Leland and lived a quiet life, teaching in Baptist Sunday school again. So that's that story, and that's how I wended my crooked way from writing novels to turning to nonfiction for a time. I've written other nonfiction books, biographical books, but I just wanted to talk about how I specifically got to this book and wrote about some things about my life I'd never written before and about the Delta and this particular event. Okay?
I think we have time for some questions. If anybody has a question, raise your hand. We'll bring the microphone to you.
Thank you.
What was the time period from the murder until the trial?
Oh, brief. But at that point, it seems that trials took place more quickly in Mississippi than they do now. The murder happened in November. The grand jury met and indicted her in January of 1949. The trial was supposed to begin in February, but there was a sickness and they postponed it to the Second Circuit Court time in June 49, so like 8-9 months. And the trial was what captured our attention, I think, perhaps even more. And when I say our, I'm talking about my girlfriends and me and my mother. We couldn't talk about anything else. And we looked for clues in pictures of Ruth Dickins, of, evil, of darkness, and we were afraid of her just looking at her picture. We convinced ourselves she was bad, she was mean, she was evil. We were girls, and girls get up about things like that. They just want to know more and more and more, and about things they're not supposed to want to know.
We have a question from the live stream. What was the most interesting or surprising bit of research you saw at the State Archives?
That's pretty easy. I started mentioning a minute ago. There was an evidence box. The shears weren't there, and there was other evidence that didn't make it to the archives. But there were all these little envelopes, about, I think, 4 by 6 inches, with tiny things, a button off Ruth Dickins' blouse that had been torn off and this and that. one thing that was always mentioned in the detailed descriptions of the state of Mrs. Thompson's body was that in her right hand, she clutched. They found this actually at the funeral home when she was being prepared, a wad of hair, which turned out to be her own hair. And the only thing, I mean, it wasn't specified why she had her own hair in her clutch so tightly. The only thing I and other people could figure out is she had a horrible wound in her skull that she pulled at it because it hurt, and, you know, it came off in her hand, and she died holding it. And I have a picture I took with my phone of me with that wad of hair in my hand. And something, I mean, the surprise was not what happened. Everything was a surprise, pretty much. But I held it, you know, and there it was. And also the color they described in the paper is not the color it was.
Ruth was too old for a curfew, so what was the motive behind her murdering her mother?
She was too old for curfew. There are many. The prosecution came up with a money motive, and there were things that happened after J.W. Thompson died. He left no will, and which leads one to think perhaps he was murdered. It's hard to imagine a man like him not leaving a will when he had a lot of property. It was all in his name, not his and Ruth's. And there was some dissension. Ruth took over the money matters regarding the land. Her brother took over. He did the dirt part, as they called it, and he farmed the land, and they failed utterly. And Ruth began borrowing money secretly. And so in the end, the brothers said, I can't do this anymore. We're just borrowing and losing, and the land is in terrible shape. And it was eventually came into John Dickins' name, Ruth's husband. So this was dissension in the family. He actually saved their possession of it, but he wasn't a Thompson. So there was that. A lot of people thought had sexual motives, that Ruth had some proclivities that her mother didn't approve of, that she might have thrown in Ruth's face, but it's pure speculation. It's really not known. Ruth never said she did it. She claimed, innocence the whole way. So did her husband. And as the sheriff said, right after, during the trial, when they asked him why he didn't question her, he said, Ms. Dickins said it was Negro, and I only looked for a Negro. So she used that the whole way through, really. I don't think it was the money only. It's just not enough.
Have you written anything else, or are you going to write anything else that has autobiographical material in it?
Well, what's your name? June. Okay, June. Thank you for asking that. I wish I knew because I keep going there, and this happened, I was 10, so I figure about the 4th grade. 2 big things happened in school. It's interesting to me that identify those years, especially the elementary school, Carrie Stern, as 1st grade, 2nd grade, not age. This was the 4th grade. In the 4th grade, Chinese students were allowed to come to the white public schools. That was a big thing, and 4 students were in my homeroom. And the next year, a girl named Elwyn Ward moved to Greenville, and she was an amazing and very ambitious girl who turned my life around. You know, I was enamored of her. She was a dancer. She never gave up. She ran for everything. She won. And she wore makeup and Shalimar perfume. And and this happened. And so I keep going back there. And, you know, the whole thing about the Chinese students, I have a friend who came into my homeroom that day. I perfectly remember Mrs. Greer's homeroom. And what my life has been kind of interesting. I've lived all over this country and kind of a crazy life. So, would you like me to? Okay. Okay.
This would normally be the part of the program where I would invite everyone to come over to the table and buy a copy of Beverly's book. We are transitioning to a new point of sale system in the store, and they don't have the mobile sales up and running yet. So I'm going to invite you instead to walk right on the other side of this wall and buy a copy of Beverly's book and come back, and she'll be glad to sign copies for you. Thank you all for being here today. Remember tomorrow's gallery talk upstairs with Ellen Meacham, the book festival on Saturday, and then come back next Wednesday for History is Lunch when we'll have TJ Ray. For now, help me thank Beverly Lowry for this fabulous program today.